maybe even got outside. It's very beautiful out there. We have a very, very good afternoon program, as you can see from reading your materials. And we're going to start a little bit early just to maintain the right kind of pace so that we've left enough time for the various activities that take place prior to Secretary Clinton's arrival. And what we're going to do first is polling. So let's pull up the first question, as we have done in each one of these sessions while these guys are getting mic'd up. Discoveries of shale gas and oil in the U.S. and Canada and worldwide are the single most important geopolitical game changer since the end of the Cold War. A, true. B, false. %73 of you say false. Well, let's skip this panel. All right, well, let's try another question. America should do everything in its power, including limiting exports of liquefied natural gas, to ensure cheap, plentiful availability of homegrown energy supplies to U.S. consumers. True or false? Let's do everything in its power to limit export, including limiting exports, with our focus being cheap homegrown energy. And 70% of you say false. I think something has happened to this audience over lunch. You've turned a little ornery, but that's good. It's gas. Is that it? Yeah. Okay, I hope that, well, I was going to say I hope that passes, but I don't. Next question. The potential environmental implications of tapping into shale oil and gas in the United States are likely to be managed in a way that does not significantly impede development of these sectors in the next decade. True or false?
I notice we don't get to vote.
You do not get, no, but you get to speak later on. They said true. They're optimistic here that we are going to manage this properly. Next. Exporting LNG from North America to Japan and Europe would be a potential boon for our allies, reducing costs and dependency. The U.S. should do what it can to promote the development of these new energy supply lines. True or false? We tried to keep these simple because of the post-lunch lag. Okay, so 87% of you say we should be doing that. Next. I believe that the single most important consequence of the changing U.S. energy paradigm will be American energy independence by 2030 or before. B, reducing U.S. involvement in unstable energy supplying regions overseas. C, reducing dependency on coal and other carbon-intensive energy sources. D, unintentionally despoiling our environment further. E, promoting economic growth in North America for the next decade or more. Or F, other. What's going to be the single most important consequence of the changing U.S. energy paradigm? And the answer is E. Promoting economic growth in North America for the next decade or more is the leading answer, with reducing U.S. involvement in unstable energy-providing regions overseas being the second answer, and also clearly a very important one to discuss. Three more. Resource nationalism or resource conflict will be a central driver of international conflicts and tensions during the decade ahead. True or false? And 81% of you say that it will be one. And next. On balance, which of the following resource-related issues do you feel is most likely to demand the most attention from U.S. policymakers in the decade ahead? A, water security. B, food scarcity and food price inflation. C, energy price volatility and disruptions. D, rare earth metal availability. And E, other.
Likely or should?
Is likely. Likely. So 46% of you say energy price volatility and disruptions. But interestingly, water scarcity is the next biggest one on the list. Next, and finally, It is unprecedented in recent history for a major power like China to depend on a potential rival like the US to defend the sea lanes upon which it depends for resources. This situation is likely to last, A, only a few more years, B, for at least the next decade, C, for at least the next 2 decades, and D, for the foreseeable future. Clearly, that's of strategic importance. So 45% of you say for at least the next decade, which means China will be depending on us to defend their energy supplies for at least the next decade. It's an interesting prediction from a knowledgeable audience. So I think this morning got labeled, perhaps unfairly, the focus on pessimism, risk, and threats. And this afternoon may be labeled, perhaps also unfairly, a more optimistic focus on economic drivers, economic-related issues, and some positive trends. Clearly, with regard to energy, resources broadly, climate-related issues, it's a mixed bag. We're very lucky to have a great group of people with us here to talk about it. On my immediate right is the Acting Undersecretary of Energy, David Sandalow. Beside him is Phil Sharp from Resources for the Future. Beside Phil is Hal Quinn, who's the president and CEO of the National Mining Association. And beside him is Amos Hochstein, who is with the U.S. Department of State and is the Deputy Assistant Secretary who looks after issues like this. Before we get into the weeds of these, you heard the answers to those questions. Any surprises?
I think the big surprise for me is the attention on these issues that's grown over the past year or two. I walked into this room about an hour ago as the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States was uttering the words natural gas. And what he continued to say is that this...
He actually refused to enter the room prior to mentioning those.
He underscored the geostrategic importance of the energy issue, and it's a constant theme in the foreign policy discussions that I'm in. So I think this is a very prescient panel, David. Congratulations.
Well, it's not, right. Give us credit for that. The reality is every panel today has mentioned energy and resources. Every panel has seen this as being central in one way, whether it's central to disconnecting or changing our relationship in the Middle East, central to economic growth being driven in the Middle East, the US, China, Europe, disconnecting Europe from Russian dependency on natural gas. These things have come up throughout. Phil, you've been doing this a long time. This is quite a striking well, not okay. You look great, but it's quite a striking change, right? I mean, what do you think is been the trigger of it?
Well, there's no question about it. It's a striking change for the United States in particular because we have been operating on energy policy for nearly 40 years under the presumption that both oil and natural gas were in quite limited supply, and even though we've been wrong regularly about when they would become seriously in short supply, that was always the assumption. And the assumption today, which by the way we might be cautious about over-assuming, is that in fact both on the natural gas and even on the oil front with tight oil, we are in a different world than what we were in. And I do think that the most transformative thing of this decade for the United States is the development of shale gas, which by the way, very important to recognize, was not predicted by industry, not predicted by academia, not predicted by the government. It all came as a major, unexpected development in our society. And this just goes to the issue of how difficult it is to plan and project ahead.
Well, I can't tell you how many, I'm sure you, and David, I know you did. 4 years ago, all of us were on panels on energy-related issues. And if anybody had the temerity to bring up the idea of energy independence or reducing our dependence on overseas, they were laughed off the stage by experts of both sides. This was considered an impossibility. And now it's conventional wisdom, which suggests it may not happen. But
David, it wasn't projected 4 years ago, but if I may make a parochial point, it was funded 30 years ago by the U.S. Department of Energy, where I now work. The U.S. Department of Energy in the late 70s and early 80s was doing the seminal research in hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, that has now led to this revolution, and that's an important guide as we think about policy of the future. An important question is, what are the technologies we're going to be funding today that might have the same transformational impact in 30 years?
Actually, but there was another one, the federal government, which is critical. This is 3D imaging, which is used in drilling now, so you know right where you want to go with that drill. Not possible 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
Okay, well, this gets me to an interesting dichotomy here, how we live in a country here where we now have a representative of a Democratic administration taking credit for the prescience of the Department of Energy in developing fracking technologies. We have Phil here talking about other technologies we've developed. We've come a long way, and we're a bit schizophrenic on this right now. So there is this sense that the number one concern of people on, let's say, the left generalize, which is job creation, depends on our ability to tap into this. And yet it's in conflict with some other leading priorities of similar groups with regard to the environment and climate and so on and so forth. So how do you think this schizophrenia is likely to work itself out?
Well, after
I'm
we get
speaking to you in your capacity as a psychiatrist.
okay, I mean, after we get past the battles of who should take credit for this
Yeah, right,
transformational change.
exactly.
Actually, I think we move on from it fairly quickly because, indeed, the shale gas revolution is transformational. The question is how are we going to use that, and how we position ourselves. In terms of the manufacturing sector, it clearly has a lot of knock-on positive effects. But that's not the only reason why we're going to reestablish the manufacturing sector in this country, because there's a lot of other trends going on in terms of China and so forth, in terms of labor rates, productivity, that are also a key piece of all that. So from my perspective, there's other things out there that we wonder about. What is the next disruptive technology that changes not only energy space, but the mineral space in terms of metals and how we use them, and then in terms of whether that gets into the question of not just scarcity, but more supply security. Yeah.
Good, and I want to come back to some of those things. Now, Amos, for those, this is a room full of policy wonks. So it is probably one of the few places in the world where I could use the acronym QDDR, and 70% of the people would know what I was talking about. But it's interesting in the sense that the QDDR, that whole process that took place during this administration, led by Secretary Clinton, about changing priorities, a lot of people thought, well, this is kind of abstract, and some of these are kind of academic. But there was a focus on adding resources in the area of energy, restructuring to make energy more of a priority in the context of this administration, which continues some earlier changes in structure of the department in the preceding couple of years. I just want to, you're a beneficiary and an example of this change, and I'm just wondering, why is it important for the State Department to be playing in this area with increased resources and manpower right now?
Well, I think it follows really what David was saying earlier. As you look at the questions in the polling questions, there's a lot of attention to energy, and today it's almost a non-question of why the State Department should be involved and viewing energy as a national security issue. But as one of the first recommendations to be implemented out of the QDDR, to create an energy bureau, and if you look around the world, the role that energy plays in both conflict and in opportunity for good, it's almost everywhere we look. So if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, where Israel is now joining the family of nations producing gas, with Lebanon just to its north, and Egypt's resources, and Cyprus coming in with the implications there, implications in Africa, both East and West Africa, and both gas and oil. Immediate to our south in the Western Hemisphere is burgeoning as a producing countries in energy resources, and South China Sea having conflict there on that is, while political in nature, the main interest that there is driving the conflict is what's below the water and the potential over there. So I think that while a year ago, when Secretary Clinton first established the Energy Resources Bureau, wherever we went, we had to explain, look, why does the State Department need a bureau on energy? I think today, wherever we go, I think that we don't even get that question anymore. It is so clear that we as the United States need to look at energy as a driver of national security issues, as foreign policy. And with some of the things that are happening in the United States, where we're no longer importing natural gas when we were before, and we're debating exports of natural gas now, where our production of oil has increased so significantly. That has changed our position as a country in the world and how other countries see us. From prior to this, we were a consumer. And today we are on gas, we're at neutral and potentially a competitor. What it means of how we can conduct our foreign policy around the world. What does that mean? Just the act alone of not importing natural gas has diverted all that natural gas elsewhere in the world. So as Europe is looking to diversify its resources from Russia, that helps that process and allows us to play an even greater role in the world. And I think that while Secretary Clinton started talking about this a couple of years ago, clearly I think today wherever we go, this has been a welcomed change in American foreign policy.
Wait, so I want to go ahead.
I think in one way you've got to back up to what the real transformation has been in the last 40 years, and that is where development has occurred and the speed with which it's occurred, as well as population growth. It has been outside of what we used to call the industrial world. When we had the crisis in 1973, what we were really concerned about was feeding us in Japan and Europe. And today, all of our nations are really at minimal growth in demand kind of things, but global growth in energy demand is much more significant. And this has changed the drive for resources as well as all these power relationships. And just one other thing I'd say is we want to be a little careful. What surprised me most was the overstatement that I thought was in every one of those questions about this transformation of gas, which I think is significant. But I don't think there's any way we could begin to claim that we do not need a foreign policy that deals with energy and our continuing both our own internal need, but also because our economy is obviously attached to all the other major economies, we have to care about this. So energy independence in the campaigns, both presidential candidates and all, going back at least to Nixon, have sworn fealty to this, and it's always been so over the top and so dismissive of what the real problems are and why we have to have a State Department focused on this as well. That's not going to go away because of the new natural gas in the United States. It changes the issues, it changes the players, but not the fundamental that we have to be worried about this.
I don't mean to be impertinent, but in your case.
And
I think you do.
The Assistant Secretary.
But let me ask you a question. How many agencies do we have to have in the U.S. government focusing on energy before we have an energy policy?
I actually, on my way into the position that I'm in now, somebody gave me a series of treatises that are like about this thick, and they were the energy policies of successive administrations. Right. I actually think it is a myth and incorrect to say that the United States has not had energy policies. We've had energy policies.
Well, there's a difference between having energy policy documents and actually having an energy policy, right?
We've had dozens of energy policies. We do not lack for energy policies, plural. That's not the issue.
So maybe it's just the question. Well, back in the Clinton administration, we used to have a saying that we could come up with 1,000 reasons to do anything, but we could never come up with just one. Maybe the issue is we can come up with lots of energy policies, but we can't just come up with one.
Look, or two agendas is often the enemy of one agenda, right? So you've got it's the same way, different way of saying the same thing. I would just look to a strong priority that we have had at the U.S. Department of Energy, obviously key player in this, which is on energy innovation. And Secretary Chu, Nobel Prize winner in physics, came in, Department of Energy, which is a wildly dispersed organization, and said, my priority here is going to be energy innovation. And he's launched a program called ARPA-E, which is modeled after DARPA, has driven funding in this direction, and it's this type of work that's really going to make the transformational difference, I think, over the long term.
Okay.
Can I just?
Sure.
I want to talk about the point that Phil was making, because I completely agree with it. And frame it this way: that increasing energy supplies in the United States is extremely important and enormously beneficial. Reducing our oil imports pays all kinds of dividends. Energy independence of the type that it's usually conceived of in the public mind requires something else, which is a change in our transportation fleet so it is no longer as dependent on oil as it is today. Maybe the single most important statistic in the energy world, I believe, is that 95% of the energy to move our cars and trucks comes from one source, and that's petroleum. And that doesn't seem odd to us, actually, because we all grew up in a world in which 95% of the energy to move cars and trucks comes from this one source, and so do our parents, so do our grandparents. But it's actually, in some ways, odd, and it has profound geostrategic implications, profound economic implications, profound environmental implications. And so moving to a world in which our cars and trucks are moved not just by petroleum, but also by natural gas, which is happening in the United States, particularly with heavy-duty trucks, by electricity. The Volt today is the most popular model among all General Motors models, among its drivers, and the steady uptick in the growth of that is pretty striking. And by biofuels, tremendous potential, and the type of energy independence is typically thought of in the public mind requires that, as well as increasing supply.
And if I could just
All right, but we got to let these other guys into the conversation.
Partly back up what exactly David is saying, but again, be very careful about this presumption of how we can be indifferent to what happens in those, whether it's the world oil market, whether it is the ethanol market, because now we're no longer trying to keep out sugarcane ethanol, which, by the way, is much more efficient than corn ethanol in terms of for lots of reasons. And so we are going to be, and this audience is not one that you usually have to preach this issue to, it's other audiences in America which do not catch the fact that we are very much engaged in the international arena. By the way, the same as we have on the invested a serious interest in the regulatory oversight of nuclear developments in all these countries, not internationally, but how.
Okay, well, we may come back to that in a second. Let me go to you, Hal, though, because you lead an association of companies involved in extractive activities of one sort or another. The United States has not recently, historically, been an easy environment for that, whether it's in terms of the regulatory environment or whether it's in terms of attracting foreign investment so that people can invest in that environment and so forth. So you have a perspective on the kind of factors that are likely to play into whether we can even tap into these resources in the way that everybody seems to expect will only be natural. There seem to be some impediments. How would you characterize them?
Well, I think we're an energy-rich country, we're a resource-rich country, but we often act as if we're resource-poor, and some of the policies are some of the impediments. I know in our area, particularly metals, and I think the oil and gas industry experiences some of the same things, which is you have issues such as, in terms of attracting investment, you have impediments related to access to the best lands. You have issues related to the tax structure. And in the metals side, we'll probably have 50% more add-ons after the corporate income tax than, let's say, manufacturing. You also have issues related to permitting and getting authorizations. So, and of all those three, I'd say the last one's probably one of the most largest impediments in our space when we're competing for capital globally, and we're looking at multi-decade investments. And so we judge those based on net present value. And if it's taken me 7 to 10 years on average in this country to get a permit and all the authorizations for a major investment that could be anywhere from $400 million to over $1 billion, and I can take that same amount of capital and go to South America or somewhere else, and I can get those permits in 2 years, the value proposition is pretty clear. There's a higher risk premium, and the present value of that investment is getting destroyed as we wait around. So the way I'd sum it up is those are three things I think a lot of folks in the resource industries look at. And then
that play into, let me just ask you a specific area. We were talking about it earlier. David gave I think a pivotal speech on the issue of rare earth metals. 4 years ago, no one had heard of rare earth metals either. At least most people hadn't even thought about them. And then everybody woke up one morning, it was actually after David gave his speech, and said, what? The Chinese are producing almost all of this. We're producing almost none of this, and you need this for all these new technologies that we're going to require in order to move to sort of a new energy, efficient energy, alternative energy environment. Do the factors that you're talking about, did they play a role in because the rare earths exist in the U.S., so we weren't taking advantage of them. Did they contribute to that?
Well, in that particular case, it's some of that, but it was an issue of pricing, world pricing to support the resources we had here, and while that sort of waned, a lot of the technological know-how went to China, who was actively developing their industry, notwithstanding what the price structure is. I mean, what the Chinese want, I mean, this is my view, and I can share by others, it's whether it's being export quotas and things like that for rare earths, it's not just higher prices for the raw material, it's the value add. And if you have a constricted supply, the folks who need that for their value add will eventually have to come to China to put their facilities in there in terms, and they're pursuing basically what is a mine-to-magnet strategy to take from the front end of the supply chain all the way to the value add. And then you can spread that across a lot of resources across the board is what you really want to go after is the value add. But if you don't have the front end, then your supply chains
Well,
are
this
very-
goes to David's point about new technologies and who's going to develop the new technologies and where they're going to come from. The Chinese are spending more money on alternative energy technologies than every other country in the world added up. And if you combine that with resource policies like you're talking about and IP policies like that, it's clear they're going to try to maintain or gain an edge because of those kind of policies.
Certainly.
Amos, let me ask you a question. This is a very sophisticated group. But if you go outside of this room to a slightly less sophisticated group and you speak about shale gas and foreign policy, the first reaction or the second reaction after can I get rich on this, is it in my backyard, is, oh good, we can be done with the Middle East. You know, we don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. Now, while that's clearly not true because of what Phil was talking about and global energy markets and so on and so forth, it does seem like a potential headwind for U.S. policymakers in the Middle East. As people start saying, we have to spend more on that when we've got all this stuff here, that's costly, they're difficult to deal with. I'd rather be dealing in Pennsylvania or Ohio. Do you see, you know, what is the potential tension that's going to come up out of this from a foreign policy perspective?
I think you're right. I mean, the question is the right question, and it's not only in this room. It's actually debated and discussed in the Middle East. On some press in the Middle East has talked about it. If the United States has all this resources, especially after we had a lot of leaders here talk about the words that everyone here said we probably shouldn't be using of energy independence. What does that mean for the Middle East? What does that mean for the United States? And I think it's important to discuss it because it doesn't. Our resources here don't change our attitudes in the Middle East. We weren't there because of resources, and that our foreign policy around the world is not dependent only on ensuring supply of resources for the United States. So I think that doesn't change, and our policy towards those countries don't change. I also think, going back to what was said before, we're not seeking to be energy independent in the sense that a barrel of oil that comes out here, its price is still dependent on the global price. So it's, regardless of how much oil we continue to produce, the price in the United States will be dependent on the global price. So as crises occur around the world, the geopolitics impact on oil prices will affect us as well. So the more we can use our resource wealth here to address our own economic growth, and to use it just for that, and to understand that we have to continue to have a foreign policy that engages the world. And as the world grows, and you have some of the fastest growing countries in Africa and Asia that are resource thirsty, and their demand curves for energy products is only increasing exponentially over the next several years, the more resources that are diverted away that used to come to the United States, that can be diverted away to those countries, protects us with some kind of stability in the markets, or potentially with some stability in the markets. And that's our goal in not only in the Middle East, but elsewhere, to continue our engagement there so that we can have the kind of dialogue to produce sustained growth and not worry about the energy, securing the energy routes for the United States. So I think it's an important thing to discuss, because if we let it get ahead of ourselves and let people discuss this energy independence paradigm that I don't believe exists, then we'll get, if we fall behind that argument, the debate will get ahead of us. And I think it's important to continuously talk about it. And it comes up, I have to tell you, in almost every region that we travel to and have meetings with very sophisticated crowds such as this one. But anywhere we go, that's one of the first questions. When are you going to export your gas to us, specifically our country? And the second question is, what does this mean for your foreign policy and engagement in the world?
By the way, just as a heads up to everybody here, we started a little early because a couple of these folks have to leave a little early, and I wanted to ensure that everybody had a break between sessions rather than recreating this morning's test of will. So I think we're going to aim to end this panel around 3:15. And so in about 10 minutes, we'll start with questions from all of you on a variety of issues. I want to get through a couple of points. I do want you to note, however, that in our commitment to energy efficiency, apparently we are not using air conditioning in this room, which is something we might want to address before we lose large portions of the audience. In any event, one of the things that's associated with the international dimensions of this, and was mentioned in the polling, has to do with LNG exports and global supply chains. And I think in an earlier panel there was a discussion mentioned about, changing resources, changing sources of energy, changing demand for energy, changing supply chains, using the polar routes and other kinds of things. But among all of these, the one that I keep hearing the most about is U.S. LNG. And they say, well, there's 13 licenses waiting for approval, and now the election is over, and ambassadors must come and call on you on a regular basis and say, when are you going to approve these? We need them for one reason or another. But there seems to be also some domestic, call not to approve all of those. Keep them here, keep the prices of gas more regionalized, keep them a little more low, use them as a stimulus to the economy. And I know this is a tough issue, but I'm just wondering, how do you think it's going to be grappled with and played out?
Well, so this sophisticated audience may not know the basic statutory framework.
Sophisticated and good-looking.
That's
audience.
right. So for those who aren't familiar with the basic statutory framework here vests in my boss, the Secretary of Energy, decision whether or not to approve exports of of natural gas from the United States. With some qualifiers I can talk about, but let me say that one of the rules that I have discovered is useful in a career in Washington is not to announce anything when your boss has yet to make a decision. And so I definitely plan to adhere to that rule here. Also, I should add, in what I've found to be one of the most favorite phrases in the past couple of months, don't reduce your boss's optionality. So I don't intend to do that either. But let me just explain for those who may not be familiar with it, that the Natural Gas Act, although it provides permitting through the Department of Energy for the export of natural gas, it says that for exports to a free trade country or a country with which the United States has a free trade agreement, that license or application shall be approved. And then for countries that don't have free trade agreements with the United States, that a determination is made whether or not the export is in the United States' national interest. That's a process that's ongoing. We've commissioned a macroeconomic study on that topic, which is going to be released by the end of the year for public comment, and those comments will feed into my boss's decision, which he will make, and I will talk about it publicly after he makes it and not before.
This is a perfect Washington answer. It had a term of jargon, optionality. It was opaque, and it involved setting up a commission or some study group to analyze what the outcome was going to be.
I don't consider that to be a compliment.
Why don't you tell what we should do?
Well, I'm inclined to say we say yes, but this is going to be a much slower development than the way the conversation seems to go, which is as if once they pull the trigger, the gates are going to flood open. First of all, you have to start with the terminals we have now, which were designed to import. Those can more cheaply be turned around than trying to build new terminals. I mean, we're talking a big expense here. We're all still talking about $4.50 per MCF that you add on in transportation costs to get this stuff to Japan. So at the moment, there is a huge differential in the world market on natural gas, but that is going to begin to shrink. We don't know when. Partly our own prices are starting to come up because we're restricting, the market is restricting production here. But second of all, as we begin to develop those resources elsewhere, many people believe, I don't know what the facts are, and their study may tell us, that this is actually going to be a fairly slow development, even if they start handing out licenses, because the licenses may not all get built right as quickly as you think. I don't want to compare this to the nuclear renaissance that we just had in the country, but one might be a little more cautious about these are huge investments that have to be made and bets you have to take. At the moment, they would look very good on this price differential, but you begin to shrink that price differential, they don't look so hot.
So the good news is it might keep prices low. The bad news is, if it keeps prices low,
not
investment
gonna
in the
do what-
natural gas is going to go slowly,
Right.
and we won't be able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, I have a question with a couple of panelists about when we talk about the particular law that requires this procedure, whether it's is it rather antiquated in today's world in terms of given the pace of globalization and so forth. Does it really make sense to still have that restriction? I recall when we had the Fuel Use Act in terms of how we fired up our electric grid, and that was repealed when we viewed, we took out certain
I
controls.
voted for it and voted to repeal
Yeah.
it. So I've been on both sides of the thing.
So I was just curious about the opinion about whether this has really outlived its usefulness, unless for some reason there's less than total confidence in the shale revolution, so to speak.
Well, I'm going to guess that neither of the U.S. government officials are going to answer that question. But
Well, I think it probably is antiquated, but it also may come in violation of the WTO if they start turning down all these applications. I don't know what, I'm sure they're looking at that legal question, but whether or not you've got to have a pretty damn good reason not to.
let me
play in
jump
the world
on
market.
to just another dimension of this question before we open this up. Because when you talk about natural gas and you talk about us producing it for ourselves or us sharing it with our allies, and it gets to the issue of who's got what, and the Europeans feel they're squeezed by their dependence on Russian natural gas, and the Japanese feel that paying $17-18 for natural gas when they're getting it from Australia or going from Qatar is an unreasonable burden on them, and this goes across many resource areas. There's a growing sense, particularly as developed countries are weak, going through economic problems, and developing countries are needy, going through growth problems. It's kind of inward-looking period, and let's deal with our own problems. And this can lead to resource nationalism, trade war, and that kind of thing. And as you, Hal, look forward, as your companies look forward, are they concerned that's something on the horizon that could be disruptive or a problem?
Oh, clearly on the minerals metal side, and we see it already. We see saber rattling on nationalizing projects in various countries, and that is a deep concern after making those types of investments. And some of it might be motivated by some additional rent seeking, so the threat is to take the investment in exchange for some type of renegotiation of the concession. So it's a deep concern. It is very unsettling, and it's unsettling in the investment markets as well.
Do you want to
Capital
add-
markets.
add-
Yeah, I think an element of what you said is, if I can expand on that, the countries that are also producing these new resources, the expanded resources, are not necessarily the countries that for the last several decades we've come accustomed to as the big producers. Russia, Saudi Arabia, et cetera. It's actually new countries that are coming into this where again, goes back to why we want this, why it's important to have a foreign policy around energy. Because it's not only about securing our foreign policy and securing routes and so on. It's also about working with these countries that have never produced resources before, whether it's in the minerals or in the hydrocarbons. And if we don't address some of the issues of how those governments are able to handle an economic boom directed from hydrocarbons, then we're going to end up where you just described in your question. So part of this is to try to work with countries that are just at the beginning of this process. And Mozambique's finds in natural gas are enormous. And they're new to this process. And the more we can work with countries around the world that are coming into this, where they're not the traditional producers, and working on good governance, and understanding how to make sure that the old oil curse is not, or resource curse is not repeated in these new developing countries, I think we can avoid a lot of what you're talking about. If we don't, we run the risk of turning this economic opportunity for developing countries into crises in the future.
I think that's right, but I think who's already working that angle, and it's different, is the Chinese. And where we have soft aid type of approaches to some of these countries, they're doing hard spend, and they're going in and they're doing concessional financing. They're taking equity interests in some of the fringe producers in exchange for offtake agreements to finance the loans and so forth. And a big part of it is building the infrastructure out. So while we want to talk about governance, they're in there building a capacity not only for that country but for themselves.
Well,
in terms of diversifying
they're
their market.
clearly not the only ones. I've got a couple of jobs, and in addition to the FP job, I also have a little consulting company that does stuff in energy and resources. And we did a study for the Business Roundtable a couple of years ago looking at energy and resource policies in 25 countries around the world and whether they kind of had a national policy to serve their own growth, a competitiveness policy. We were one of the countries. 24 of the countries had active policies to promote their growth by tapping into their resources and saving them for themselves and competing and setting up policy regimes to protect them. And one country didn't. And we were the outlier. The United States was clearly not in the flow of those countries. I do want to ask one last question.
Can I just comment just on one thing? Because we hear this a lot, the Chinese, they're doing all this work. And I think they are. They're trying very hard. They're working very hard. But I think in almost every country that you go to that's coming into the resource boom, when you go into them, they want American companies. They want American technology. They want American assistance. They want our wherever we've offered the technical assistance and good governance, they want the assistance. They don't always want the implications of what it means. But there is that desire there. And I get the fact that the Chinese are putting a lot of effort into this. I don't take that same defeatist, I think self-defeating approach that they're beating us. I think that we have what to offer here on the good governance that in some countries where they've told us, look, we look at some of our neighbors who have been producing for 40, 50 years, and they have nothing to show for it. Their countries are just as poor today as they were 40, 50 years ago when they discovered some of these resources. So we understand that we have to do something a little bit different if we want to make sure that our legacy is different than theirs.
Okay, let me ask one question that's going to go across the group, and then we're going to open it up. But I would be remiss if we didn't bring it up, because in addition to talking about energy this morning in several of the discussions, we also talked about climate and the fact that we came into the Obama administration, it was pre-Copenhagen, there was a sense that climate was going to be a big issue, that some kind of carbon trading system and some kind of global agreement was on the horizon. It didn't happen in Copenhagen. In fact, what we went to in Copenhagen was from kind of transatlantic consensus about how to handle this into something different. And initially we said, well, this is the Chinese, the Indians, and others dragging their feet. But they actually had a somewhat different model. Their model was, we're going to go and invest in these areas in a self-interested way. We're not setting up these systems. We want to spend less money on energy. We want to preserve our resources. We want to create jobs. We want to create exports. And it's not a perfect solution, but it is driving a lot of investment in these areas. And I'm just wondering, as you look forward, as we look to a second term of the Obama administration, as we look to the next 4 years, the president said after Sandy, now's the time we can do, Superstorm Sandy, now's the time we can begin to focus again on climate as an issue. Do you foresee real changes in this regard?
A couple of points on this, David. First, it's worth highlighting that U.S. greenhouse gas emissions are at their lowest level in about 20 years. And that is directly related to the technology points I was making earlier, because this has a lot to do with the shale gas and the move to shale gas. I think the potential to accelerate trends in this area is enormous. There's a wealth of government programs in this area that I think are making a difference. I just want to highlight one of them that we've been working on. It's a process launched by Secretary Chu called the Clean Energy Ministerial. For the first time in summer of 2009, energy ministers got together from around the world to focus on clean energy and the dissemination of clean energy. And they've held these meetings every year. There was actually, interestingly, there was one in Abu Dhabi, there was one in London, and the next one is coming up in Delhi in April. And the buy-in around the world on this agenda has been tremendous. It's countries getting together, working cooperatively to figure out how to accelerate the deployment of clean energy technology. So I think that type of tool can make an enormous difference in helping to cut emissions.
Do you foresee real change?
Well, first of all, just to play on that, it's not only are our emissions low, our folks have just done estimates that suggest that by 2020 we'll come very close to meeting the president's commitment of 17%. We can't be certain about that, but they're below the year 2005 for a variety of reasons. Part of it's government policy, part of it's slowly growth economy. But let me suggest to you that things have really changed here again internationally about this. The Kyoto was based on the old world. The old world, which divided between those have-nots and those who had, and those who have not were not supposed to have to do more than voluntary stuff. That just went out the window at Copenhagen, and it had to at some point go out the window. The second thing is we were making international policy as if it was a general assembly. Now, nobody in their right mind, in their practical ways, knows that you can make any kind of decisions that way. You can't make them in the House of Representatives. How on earth can you make them in the General Assembly? What you have to do is do what the Bush administration has done and what this administration has done, is to start to say, let's get the important players together and let's begin to figure out how we build from the ground up. And we have no historic precedents for anything worldwide in which it's from the top down that we do this. That doesn't mean there were lots of useful educational things that happened out of the Kyoto process, but that was the old way of doing business. We're in a different, or attempting to do business, we're in a different place now, too. I do believe this is going to go forward. The science is not giving up on this, whatever claims you might have heard in any campaign, and the American public aren't either. Polling actually shows that throughout this campaign, the Americans that believe this is a problem and we have to act on it is probably at 70% and has been growing in every sector, conservative, Republican, and others. The more the politicians kept their mouths shut, the more the American public began to accept that this is serious business that we have to get on to, kind of proposition. Our problem in the country is not the American people. Our problem is leadership incapable, whether it's in the business community, the environmental community, or the political community, to be able to get around a table and decide how to get us on a more serious path.
Al, one of the dimensions of this that people expected after the election was a battle between the Republican Party and the EPA. You know, that this was something that was coming. But with the election and with Sandy and with some of the changes in the makeup on the Hill, do you think it's still as likely that this is going to be a real front line for combat down the street here?
Well, I think it's only a frontline combat to the extent that one party wants to push a particular resolution. I think I agree with the prior remarks of Phil and David. I think change here domestically is going to be incremental, and some of it's already underway because of fuel substitution. I think internationally, very much for the reasons Phil outlined, the Kyoto model it can't work. 3/4 of your global growth, much of it hydrocarbon centric, is coming from the emerging economies. So you got to get the main players in the room to figure out how do you get them on the right track. Finally, I just think that any credible assessment I've seen of climate change and impacts and bending the curve on that, fuel substitution will not get us there. We're going to need a couple of major technology innovations going forward. You're going to need advanced nuclear. You're going to need CCUS across the board, not just for coal, but across the board on industrial, on gas. You're going to need efficiency both in terms of not only use, but in generation as well.
If I could throw in storage also, you'll probably need enhanced
to make it
storage technology.
Yes.
What's on the horizon internationally? Do you see progress? I mean, I think you have to say, you're obligated to say, yes, there's a lot of progress. But if you could be specific about what might actually happen.
Well, first, I think State Department, we have the New Energy Resources Bureau, but we also have the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change. So I don't want to talk about the work that he's doing and they're doing, which is good work. I think they have made a lot of progress and will make more progress in the future. But I
Very surprised to hear you say that.
Yeah, it's this was supposed to be the shock value of the day. But part of the Bureau, we talked a lot about oil and gas today, but I think a third of what we do in this new Bureau is directed towards renewables and alternatives and working with DOE on this. And where we have to figure out the model that, working with countries around the world that identifies what that model, because we can't do this as foreign aid with renewables and alternatives and pump money into this and it'll make it happen. But rather, if we can identify the financing mechanisms and work with the private sector, both in the US and outside, that enables them and create the enabling environment for the private sector to make those investments in renewables and alternatives, not only here but around the world, especially in the developing world, I think that will take us a long way towards that. And just as an example, if you look at Saudi Arabia, a country that 10 years ago, if you talk to Saudi officials about renewables, they said, well, we have to keep, oil prices have to be just at that right equilibrium where it doesn't encourage the promotion of investments in renewables and alternatives. Today, the Saudis are asking, working with DOE and are working with us about identifying ways to invest an enormous amount of resources into renewables, alternatives, because if they continue to burn oil for their electricity at the rate that they're doing now, they're going to get in 20, 30 years into parity between what they produce and what they consume. And so whether it comes in through the front door because people understand the importance of climate change, or whether it comes through the back door of people understanding that this is what's right for their economy, I think that progress is going to be made, and that's the path that we're on. And whether it takes some deviations, I think that's where we're on. That's what we're focusing on for the next 4 years.
Just a quick vignette on Amos's really good point here. A Saudi official said to me sometime in the past couple of months, it's quoting him, he said, our policy is literally burning money. And he said, we don't price electricity in Saudi, and we burn oil to do it instead of selling it into global markets where we could make money for it. And so in Saudi Arabia, they have a lot of sand, which is, they can get silicon for solar panels, and a lot of solar resources. So the Saudis have issued a procurement for 41 gigawatts of solar power, which is potentially a very big impact on the market.
One thing I just add is it's very important to recognize that China is not only a competitor and sometimes a problem, perhaps, in the solar market today, but the fact is that vast market, when it begins to really absorb these renewables, it's going to drive the costs down in ways the American government can't begin to afford to subsidize this driving down. And so we should not misunderstand that a lot of these developments internationally are going to help us. Ultimately, what we need to do is get something that is cheaper than coal for India and China and other places. That will be the real victory. And to drive down the cost of these other fuels will in part happen in the marketplace because of aggressive policies in China and elsewhere.
Well, and that's part of this self-interested policy. You know, one of the ways to look at this is if developed countries are in financial straits, and developing countries have limited resources to go around to large numbers of people, the one thing we can successfully predict, given all the admonitions about how difficult it is to predict things, is that over the next few years, budgets are going to be tight, and things that, there'll be a kind of austerity boom. Things that work in an austere environment will do better. So energy efficiency works in that kind of environment. And so right alongside the gas revolution is the efficiency revolution in all of these places, because it is the one that doesn't require subsidies. It is self-subsidized. And that's another dimension to this whole thing. Susan is there with a microphone and standing behind Richard. So why don't you just give him the microphone?
Yeah, no, we have a lot of eager questioners, and first of all, I want to thank the panel and thank David in particular. You've taught us all a new Washington word, optionality, today. Take that home to your boss. He or she will be grateful. Quickly, I wanted to just fire back at you on Saudi Arabia, which connects back up our morning, in a way, to the afternoon conversation. Burning money doesn't strike one as a super sustainable long-term strategy. How much do you think the question of political volatility factors into this conversation that we're having here this afternoon?
I'm not going to talk about Saudis and that, they can speak to their own situation on that score. But look, these, in terms of the United States picture, everything we're talking about here, almost everything we're talking about, are deeply political issues. And so you see the clash of forces in this capital on a number of them. There really is a lot of potential consensus, in this area. The topic that David was talking about on energy efficiency is one that just kind of leaps out for the potential there. I think, Hal and I were talking before this about our work on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is an area where I think there's enormous potential, to really move forward and build coalitions, and a lot of other areas too. But I think, look, these are deeply political issues.
So we have a ton of eager questioners. I promise.
Thank you. Jenny Molberger with the Scowcroft Group. Thank you. It's a fascinating discussion. But with the exception of one fleeting moment, the word nuclear was not used by this panel. Do you see a future for nuclear in the U.S.? Is that part of our policy? And tying back into the Middle East that we talked about earlier, you've got the opportunities like Saudi Arabia, who are looking at nuclear as an option, looking to us for a 123 agreement for the opportunity for our U.S. industry to still be engaged, and yet I don't see U.S. industry stepping up to the plate either. Thank you.
Look, we have 104 operating nuclear plants. That's about 20% of our electricity generation. Hugely important both for electric reliability and as a carbon-free source of power. This administration has helped to restart the industry with several plants that are under construction now. using loan guarantee tools that are available, and also with a program on small modular reactors. In order to meet our carbon goals, nuclear is likely to be a very important part of the future. And by the way, of course, not just the United States. The point Phil was making earlier about load growth around the world is important here. Half the nuclear plants in the world are being built in China today. So I think nuclear is extremely important as part of our future.
And if you go out, not just the Middle East, but we've been working very closely to support American companies who are looking to build nuclear power plant, bidding on tenders in Czech Republic, yes, Lithuania, Poland, and that's, I think we're deeply involved there, and with American companies with their partners, mainly Japanese partners, but GE and Westinghouse are competing in a number of hopefully successful bids in several capitals around the world. And so I think there is a future. I think the world is divided between countries that are walking away from nuclear and others that are embracing it. And we've, in countries that want to embrace it and want to move forward, I think we've made the argument that American companies are among the companies that have the best technology. Cheaper is not always better. And so I think there is a future for nuclear. I don't think we discussed it in this in the last hour, but around the world where there's a desire, I think we have a strong interest in supporting.
It's your question in the United States. A great baseload power source, should have more of it. Here, I think there's reality here in the United States at $5 billion, north of $5 billion a gigawatt installed. You only have so many companies that really have the operational excellence. Then you take fewer than those that have the balance sheets to take that on. And I think unless you're going to be in a regulated market situation, it's going to be really tough to
Isn't part of the cost differential in the U.S. and other parts of the world caused by regulatory issues? I mean, I think a very substantial portion of it is associated with the licensing process, and the regulatory process makes it much more costly here.
Well, the risk premium goes up in terms of...
No, actually, that was more true in the 1970s when you had extremely high interest rates, and the delay really raised your capital costs enormously. That process has been changed in 1992. It's been, we've already had the issuance of several licenses, which was a big surprise to everybody from less than a decade ago. I have to disclose I'm on the board of directors of Duke Energy. We have 12 nuclear power plants. So I am actually a proponent, as long as we think we have to deal with climate, I think we are extremely foolish to rule out this important thing. I do not think it will be the solution to climate, as some advocates do. But the catch is, and one of the reason the Renaissance did not come about, on the one hand, these costs had not been projected that high of $5 billion, and now it's clear they are much more so. The other is, of course, suddenly this new natural gas supply. What does a board of directors or anybody do in terms of new power plants if there's a much cheaper supply, or the state regulators do? One thing, Susan Eisenhower is here, and I cannot help but get this in. She and I served on the President's, the Secretary's Nuclear Waste Commission, and we urged the administration and the Congress to get off the duff and actually begin to implement some policies. Otherwise, we're going to have more attacks in the courts over something called the Waste Confidence Rule and operation and extension of license and a variety of things. This can be managed, but it's got to be managed.
Let me just add 2 quick points that just sort of color the discussion. One is that of the nuclear plants being built in the world right now, something like 75% are being built in the emerging world, right, which raises a whole bunch of issues regarding security and waste and other kinds of things. That's where the action is right at the moment, and that's an important factor. It's corollary. It's not directly responsive to your argument, but it is responsive to Susan's earlier question, how this connects to our early morning discussion. One thing to keep in mind, not on the civilian use of nuclear power, but on the military use of nuclear, which is often connected, as we've seen in the Iranian case, is that if a country like Iran actually produces nuclear weapons, and it triggers a nuclear arms race in the region, you are likely to see that actually spread around the world to a lot of those developing countries, and they're going to spend an increasing portion of their limited budgets on defense. And so you will actually have a kind of a tax associated with a nuclear arms race in the emerging world that would come if it's not nipped in the bud. And so there's a broader geoeconomic as well as geostrategic consequence of failing to nip those things in the bud.
Well, and I think for another sort of non-U.S. perspective, we have the ambassador from the Czech Republic with us today, and he'd like to say a few words.
Well, I might even feel called by Mr. Pascal about the Czech Republic being one of the 25% of the world building a nuclear plant, but I just wanted to raise a question regarding natural gas consumption in the U.S. And the question is, where does the biggest potential exist in increased consumption? Is it transportation? Is it housing? Is it power production? Is it industry as large? Do you have these estimates? Do you have an estimate about investment needed for the increased consumption in these sectors?
Well, I'll answer the question, but I want to make sure to take the occasion of saying to the ambassador from the Czech Republic that the U.S. technology is the world's best. And please don't forget. As demonstrated by the shale gas revolution, sir. But I think if you talk, my take would be if you talk to most experts, they say that most of the increased use of natural gas is going to come in the electric sector. But still, there will be a significant uptick in the transportation sector as well. We've seen dramatic shifts in the electric sector in the past year. I mean, only about 2 years ago, 50% of our electricity was generated by coal, and about 20 or 22% by natural gas. That a couple of months ago switched, and more came from natural gas than from coal. 33% from natural gas, and 32% of our electricity came from natural gas. So I think that's where the biggest use is going to be. But there's a lot of potential, particularly in heavy-duty trucks, and we're starting to see networks out in the western United States, filling stations for heavy-duty trucks. And I think there's potential for fleets and light-duty vehicles as well.
Well, there's also resourcing, insourcing. In other words, if we have cheap natural gas, what you're going to see is chemical companies, plastics companies, fertilizer companies that want cheap energy deciding to locate here because of it. So there will be that additional consequence.
Yeah, very true. As an input to chemical production and other types of manufacturing processes. And for heat, yeah.
Housing? Well,
It's flat. It's flat.
Housing.
I mean, for housing, I think there is potential growth there. A lot of our housing is already, fueled with natural gas, and the capital turnover is a lot slower there, obviously.
I'm semi-psychic, and I have a feeling that there is a question about climate coming from over there.
Thank you so much, David. My name is Clara Vondersch with the Climate Works Foundation. Thank you so much for this panel. It's really wonderful. And thank you, David, for bringing up the climate question. For the first 2 hours of today, I was feeling like I was in a parallel universe because, in my mind, the biggest strategic issue we face was not discussed. I've been spending a lot of time with the climate science lately, both in my capacity as a climate worker and more recently working with Jim Hansen pretty closely. He's also one of your foreign policy honorees this year, spot number 11 to be exact. And there's no question that the science is pretty clear. I mean, I shouldn't have even equivocated with pretty. It's clear. The science is clear. Climate change is here now. And a number of reports have come out in just the recent weeks, IEA, World Bank, that basically shows that 2 degrees is receding as a distant dream at this point, and we're on track mostly for a 4-degree scenario towards the end of the century. And while I applaud, the reality in the U.S. that our emissions are down, 10-15%, we may even meet our Copenhagen targets, you guys have all virtually agreed that that was a historical accident based on natural gas and the new shale revolution. What can we do that will meet the real challenges? We know climate change is not a respecter of borders, and while emissions are down in the U.S., it's kind of a moot point when, in fact, the global emissions keep rising. From a foreign policy, from a State Department perspective, what can we do? The Doha discussions right now are going on, but we all know what the outcome will be. Tell me, give me some hope, give me some reason to think that we can solve this problem.
Give her some reason to live.
Yeah.
We have 10 minutes.
The issue is the time frame that you're talking about. First of all, it isn't all a matter of accident. A number of policies and activities have actually improved energy efficiency throughout our energy system, including especially in vehicles. But it's true that the recession and the natural gas thing made a difference. But substitution of natural gas for coal was always part of the hopeful plan. We were going to import it, though. I think the problem is in the time scale you would like, you're going to be very disappointed. But I think that the reality is several things the U.S. government should do. One is right now we're about to cut budgets all over the place. We have to for financial reasons. For God's sake, keep the science and the technology investment going. Now that doesn't mean it's managed as well as it needs to be, but that ought to be a priority. It's something the U.S. government has stood out in front about for years, and we should take credit for it, and we should keep it going. Obviously, you want to keep international negotiations going in ways, but get off the notion that you can judge that we're going to get so many tons by exactly when, and everybody's going to commit to that. That's not the way human beings are going to operate in the international world. They don't operate in American politics that way, and if that's what you set up as the goal, you're going to be massively disappointed. So it's going to take just plodding ahead and trying to find those avenues at which you can make progress. That is not what we would all like to hear, but I would just suggest to you that it's amazing how rapidly things change once they start to rotate. I would strongly urge that in this fiscal crisis, we consider a carbon tax. By the way, to be recycled for eliminating distortionary taxes that work against, and we're doing a lot of analysis of this. I'm not here to advocate, and we don't advocate, but it is quite possible that this would not be a drag on the U.S. economy at all if the things are recycled to do a better job on the fiscal side of the equation. And you've got to take care of trade-sensitive industries and things like that. That will never be the simple solution that will get you there, and environmentalists probably will say, well, it's not sufficient. But let me tell you, once you get this economy heading in the direction, you don't know what kind of innovation you get from people that are outside of Washington and outside of the big corporate offices.
I think just because you asked on foreign policy, I think from a foreign policy perspective for the last 4 years under Secretary Clinton, I think, as you know, this has been a big and a very important priority for her, and reflected through the department in the fact that there is a special envoy for climate change, and we're in all her travels and in all her meetings, this is a major priority. I think that I agree that we sometimes are disappointed in the pace that the rest of the world is moving in this, but I believe that no matter who the next secretary will be, this will continue to be a major priority for State Department and in our foreign policy, and recognizing that it is here today and that we do have to work on this, because otherwise all the things we talked about today, we're going to have to change everything of this discussion if we don't do something, if the world does not continue to work on that.
A quick point, David. There's a lot of discontinuities in this realm. If you visualize a levee in water kind of rises up to almost the top of the levee, it's just fine, but then a little change, and suddenly it's flooding down into the town below. So, I think there's a lot of discontinuities when it comes to technology as well. And one place I'd look to particularly for hope is in solar power. I mean, it is a remarkable what's happened in solar power in the past 4 years. 75% price reduction in solar panels. And so we're really at the point right now where the main barrier is not the technology costs, but it's interconnection costs and various business model issues. Labor costs, permitting issues are big in the United States. I think there's potential for dramatic growth in solar power, and there's other examples as well.
There's one thing, let me add one thing to this, which is almost all of the climate focus is on mitigation. As well it should be. I mean, that's the big issue. Well, it is, but you have to recognize that some portion of it is also adaptation. And there's two kinds of adaptation. There's reactive adaptation and there's proactive adaptation. And as we saw with Sandy, reactive adaptation is really expensive. You talk about a little rise in the water, I mean, most cities in the world, many cities in the world plan to a once in 300-year event or a once in 700-year event. We plan to a once in 100-year event. Well, we seem to be having once in 100-year events every couple of years now. And so the cost of reactive adaptation is something we can ill afford either. And so we need to have a balanced discussion about this debate. We have time for one more question.
Yes, and we have a father-daughter tandem that wants to weigh in, I'm suspecting, on climate change. So they're both eager to jump in. However you guys want to do
Okay.
it.
Well, we're going to do two more questions because I also see Senator Warner has a question.
Okay,
here, so.
yeah. Richard Muller from Berkeley Earth. Elizabeth Muller, my daughter, is the co-founder of Berkeley Earth. China last year added about 50 gigawatts of coal. They added 1/4 gigawatt of solar. It's often called 2 gigawatts, but that's only at peak. That's the capacity when the sun is overhead, is 1/4 gigawatt. It's a factor of 200 discrepancy. I believe solar can catch up, but it's not going to catch up this decade or the next decade. It will catch up. In the meantime, we need an interim solution, and we have one here. It is natural gas. The U.S. is way ahead of every other country now in natural gas, and we have the technology. Now, I'm not talking about exporting exporting natural gas. I'm talking about exporting the natural gas technology. Now, China is somewhat loath to become a technological colony of the United States. They don't want to license or buy our technology piecemeal. The most important thing we can do, and this is cheaper than anything else I've ever heard, is if we could transfer our technology to China. Not just the patents, that's not the problem, it's the know-how, knowing how to do this, knowing how to drill these things, to switch the future Chinese coal to natural gas. That would have a bigger impact in the next 30 years than anything other than an organized, coherent program of conservation. We can't afford not to do that. The question then is, how do we transfer that technology? There's opposition from the people who own it, the Schlumbergers and so on. And yet, from a world cost, this is the cheapest thing that we can do because natural gas emits half. Instead of it being 30 years to a doubling, it would turn it into 60 years of a doubling if we could switch it to natural gas. How do we do that?
Well, first of all, I guess I don't disagree with you at all on the importance that natural gas could play. My impression is the Chinese government, national government, understands that it's not, maybe not for environmental reasons, but for environmental reasons as well on coal, but not climate. They are committed to trying to develop natural gas. But I was told, at least by a major U.S. gas company that does work there, that the inhibitions come from institutional incentives that are not well constructed. And people forget that in the United States, they have been for this development, and they're not in many other parts of the world. And that's one of the biggest hurdles. They've got to deal with that. By that, they mean that the companies that have the authority to do this are the still state-owned oil and gas companies, and they are told you're supposed to do it, but they don't have the internal incentives to make this the highest priority within their own economics. I don't know if that's the full picture. It probably isn't. But the point is I don't think it's a matter of our State Department walking over and handing them the technology. There are lots of companies that are trying to get in. They have drilled some wells and stuff like that. But the reason that happened in this country is because thousands of wells were drilled by dozens of companies who were able to go in and negotiate on your little square piece of land and get it, and didn't need the federal government involved, didn't need anybody else involved. It is partly the land ownership here, it's partly the incentive that I can make money as a landowner out of it, which if I don't own what's below it, I don't. I mean, there's just a variety of cultural and institutional things that are more likely to be the problem than us delivering technology to them. It's my impression. Now, maybe the government is saying, well, you know, your companies don't want to play, we won't let you play.
I've talked to the Chinese, I've talked to the Americans. It's the know-how, it's the experience.
But
what do you do
what the Chinese have learned to do in the last decade, it seems to me, is buy that anywhere they wanted, anytime they were ready.
They can only buy it from the U.S. and the Schlumbergers are.
Yeah, I know, but I'll lay you odds if they let those companies operate in there, they will get a quite changed picture very radically.
Well, those companies are operating over there, but in very limited ways.
I know.
And they're very careful not to allow their technology to be stolen.
I understand.
In the U.S., it took 15 years to get to the point where we are.
I understand, but I don't know why we should roll over and play dead about the technology as a U.S. government policy, tossing the asset. I'll bet you when they discover how important, as I think they believe it is to them, they will find ways to open up their market. It took them 40 years to do that in general in the economy, and once they did it, they had huge economic growth. And so I'm much more willing to bet on that as opposed to us telling Schlumberger, give up your rights and hand them over to the Chinese and let them compete.
But is the proposition here that the Chinese are going to change what is essentially a coal-centric infrastructure to gas for 20 years until solar becomes viable to be the solution? Because I think that's a little bit naive to believe the Chinese are saying, I'm going to take a coal-centric backbone and make an investment just for a 20-year bridge here. Now I have the same problem because natural gas won't get you to your climate solution. So why isn't it more in their interest to do what they're doing, which is pursuing CCS? When it becomes scalable and cheaper, they will apply it across all their fossil fuel installations.
They're doing all of these things.
A lot of their coal is imported.
I understand that.
They're going to get it from the interior. They have to build it.
We're not going to, guys.
Infrastructure is a lot cheaper.
Right, folks. We're not going to be able to resolve this here. I'm glad we were able to table it, discuss it, and I hope you can continue the discussion. We've got only a minute or two left, but I saw Senator Warner, and I thought, some good opportunity.
I'll
here
be
for-
very brief, which is rare for a senator. This has been an excellent forum. The FP group deserves a great deal of credit. Quickly, from a military background, the word risk assessment. Who is doing the risk assessment on water, which came in number 2 over here, and the booming rigs going up all over America and benefiting the economy, benefiting energy policy, but that wildcatter on the back 40 coming in and sinking that.
That's right.
You know, best he tries or she, but they hit an aquifer and away she goes. Where is that? Who's doing this risk assessment?
Well, there is a lot of work being done on that, and it is being done primarily at the state level, although the EPA is involved in that. But a couple quick things is, you are absolutely right. One of the things that we've just sort of ignored here is just the assumption all this gas is going to be available only if, as even the industry, the good industry in my view, says is if you do this prudent development. Because the protection of the aquifer, they think, is technologically much easier than what you do with the surface water, but yet means everybody has to follow good rules. Remember, the drilling is what we had. The problem in the Gulf was the well casing, and that was the problem that gets to the aquifer here. So that issue is well on the table. It's being examined carefully. I would add just one other twist to that. It's not just the water. I think that is the one that could really screw it up, because the American people are very quick, and the state of New York, as you know, has banned even extended their ban on the drilling. But it is also what's called methane leakage, or just letting the gas go in the air. That is a very intense greenhouse gas if it's not burned. It's better to burn it and become CO2. And there is a big dispute going over how much of that is happening, how much of it can be mitigated. And the reason this becomes important is I don't think the government's going to be actually the people that shut this down. What I think you're going to see is the arising of citizen action that says we are taking action against Keystone, we are taking action against coal plants in this country, and now we're going to focus our attention on this. Doesn't mean they'll be successful on all that, but they can sure complicate, add cost, and delay lots of the development.
Do you have a last word on this?
Thank you. I just want to broaden your extremely important question, Senator. That's not the only water-energy interaction. And we could have an entirely different panel on the nexus between water and energy use. Energy technologies take lots of water. Coal plants take lots of water. Natural gas plants take water. Nuclear plants obviously take lots of water. And
bio.
And bio, of course. Absolutely. Thank you, David. And then water shortages are going to be one of the critical resource constraints around the world. Desalination, 13,000, I think, desalination plants around the world today. Energy costs are typically the major driver of desalination plants and their use. So there's a lot of work in this area that we need to pay attention to.
You know, it's great. One of the great things about today's discussion is that we've touched so many parts of the world. We've touched so many themes. We've touched security issues. We've touched energy issues. We've touched economic issues. We've touched every point of the world, and all of you are engaged, and there's so much to discuss. So that's very exciting. Unfortunately, in order to enable us to touch the issues we haven't touched, we're going to have to take a little bit of a break here and set up for the next panel. It's now 20 after 3. The next panel starts in 10 minutes, so please don't go too far if you must go anywhere. And come back here in 10 minutes, but please join me in thanking this terrific panel for a great discussion.